And these are the minutes from a meeting that was attended by the Republican Study Group, as well as a network of representatives from all the big right-wing think tanks in Washington, hosted by Heritage. And they came up with their wish list. What do you think was on it? School vouchers. Let's not rebuild the public school system. Let's just give parents vouchers and they can spend them in private schools. Repealing Davis-Bacon, the law that required that contractors pay the prevailing wage. New oil refineries, drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Reserve. And what's interesting about this agenda, much of it was immediately embraced by Bush. Another piece of the puzzle was turn Louisiana and Mississippi and the entire Gulf Coast into a tax-free, free enterprise zone, right? What's interesting about this is, if we think about what created this disaster in the first place, well, one was climate change, which is intimately linked to fossil fuel extraction, i.e. new refineries and drilling in the National Arctic Wildlife Reserve. And the other side of it was the neglect, the steady neglect of the public sphere, of the public infrastructure. It was the collision that we're seeing more and more between heavy weather and weak infrastructure. The neglected levees, the neglected and eroded public transit system that wasn't able to respond to the disaster, the failed state USA. And so the response was not anything that could be considered sane, which was, let's look at the causes of this disaster, let's change course in the face of the drowning of a major American city. And I have to say, I think that progressives share responsibility for this, for not being ready for this crisis with our ideas and our solutions, and having the confidence in that key moment to propose them and insist on them vigorously. So the response from the right was, let's have more of what got us here in the first place. Let's have more fossil fuel extraction. Let's use the disaster as an excuse, emergency measures as an excuse, and let's just destroy the public sector altogether. Finish the job, right? So if you go to New Orleans today, what you see is that the city has been turned into the country's leading petri dish for charter schools. More than half of New Orleans public school students are now going to charter schools, not because they wanted to, not because they chose to, but because when they were scattered throughout this country in a scandal they called evacuation, and what a lot of people in New Orleans called forced relocation or ethnic cleansing, their schools were taken from them and socially re-engineered. This is an incredibly anti-democratic move, incredibly racist. The fact that it was done in New Orleans, I think has to be seen within that context. And the largest public hospital in New Orleans, Charity Hospital, is still closed. And those public housing projects right now are slotted for demolition. And I think just 2 days ago, Bill Quigley, who is an extraordinarily courageous human rights lawyer and has been the leading public advocate representing the people who lived in those housing projects and has been standing up representing them in court, was just arrested 2 days ago for demonstrating against the planned demolitions of these housing projects. So that's what I mean by disaster capitalism. I want to talk a little bit about another shock, which is September 11th, which is really, I think, key to understanding how we got to where we are. I think retroactively, and this is, I think, why this book is resonating in this moment in the US, is that people know they've been living the shock doctrine since September 11th. That shock, that blow to the psyche of this country was expertly harnessed by this administration to push through policies that they could not push through otherwise. So I want to talk a little bit about, just because I don't really actually have time to go through the historical material that's in the book. The book is actually mostly about how this doctrine has been used in other countries and looking at how September 11th represented, in a sense, a homecoming, where this this ideology that was imposed in Chile on September 11th, 1973, with the overthrow of Allende, and then the descending of the Chicago Boys, and Milton Friedman, who used the phrase shock treatment in his letter to Augusto Pinochet, saying you should follow this shock with economic shock treatment. And then it was enforced with a third shock, a shock to bodies, the shock of torture. That was the third shock that I didn't get to before. I look at all of these key junctures, how the Tiananmen Square massacre was harnessed by the Communist Party in China to become the super capitalist party that they are today. That act of terror created the context that allowed China to be turned into the sweatshop to the world. It so terrorized the workforce, sent that message of raw terror. And we don't talk about these events within an economic context. We talk about them through a very narrow lens of human rights. And what I'm trying to do in this book is ask the why behind some of these big human rights violations, some of the big human rights violations of our time. And one of the argument in the book is that in so many of these cases, whether it was Latin America in the 70s or China in 1989, we treat these events as if they are simply human rights violations, as if they are the scene of a murder. They're a murder scene. And in fact, what they are, the site of an extraordinarily violent armed robbery, that you need this violence in order to push through the economic policies that loot these countries. And that if you're going to rob a country, you do need to use force. That's why robbers often carry guns and use them sometimes. This is a violent process, but it makes sense. And one of the things that really drives me crazy is when I hear people talk about the Bush administration as incompetent. I don't think that they are incompetent. And nor do I think that Iraq is a disaster. Nor do I think the war on terror is a disaster. Not for everyone. And so I want to talk about September 11th in this context, and I want to broaden it out a little bit to think about a little bit more about what shock means. Shock, we use the phrase fairly lightly. We say we're in a state of shock. We don't really describe what that means. A shock is a response to an event that we can't assimilate. It's an event that seems to come out of nowhere, and it is a rupture in our story. Now, that can be on an individual level. It can be a terrible loss that surprises us and shocks us, and we lose our narrative. We lose a sense of who we are in the world, and we've all seen that, and many of us have experienced that directly. We know that state of shock. It can also happen to us collectively, and many of these events that I'm describing, a hurricane like Katrina, or the tsunami, or a war like a shock and awe attack, or September 11th, what they represent are events that are too big to be assimilated into a national narrative. And the phrase blowback is really important to understand in this context. 9/11 was a classic case of blowback. And what makes it a classic case of blowback is blowback is a CIA term, as you know, as Chalmers Johnson has explained, to describe the repercussions of actions that the US government took, but that were covert actions, i.e. actions that people didn't know about by their very nature. They were covert. So when there is blowback from those actions, when there are ramifications from those actions,